Is your ability to do IVF under threat? If you have frozen embryos, should you worry about options and should you ship them out of state depending on where you live? Who will be able to decide on your future fertility options? You, your doctor, your elected officials? Are you curious about how people advocate to protect IVF and your reproductive rights? I have a very special guest on the show today, Barbara Collura, the president and CEO of Resolve, the National Infertility Association and strong advocacy group for reproductive rights. This is a part 2 of my interview with Barbara. And so if you haven't listened to part 1, I encourage you to go back to episode 73 so you can learn Barbara's backstory. She is such a special person and she's helped so many people in the fertility community, but I'd never heard her personal fertility journey and how she started volunteering with Resolve and became the leader of this incredible advocacy group. So learn that story and go back and listen to part 1, episode 73, and then come on back to this episode. In part 2, we're going to be getting into the real advocacy work and understanding how we got to this place in the United States right now where it feels like rights are falling backwards and access to fertility care is under threat. And IVF stopped in Alabama for about 3 weeks at the beginning of 2024. So in this episode, we're going to get into the real advocacy piece. And so I'm excited that you're here. Welcome to the Baby or Bust Fertility Podcast, the podcast with interviews and in-depth discussions on reproductive health, created to support anyone curious about infertility, miscarriage, and early pregnancy. I'm your host, Dr. Lora Shahine, a double board-certified OBGYN and reproductive endocrinologist and former fertility and IVF patient myself, helping to build families for almost 20 years. I'm dedicated to supporting and educating you on your family-building journey. Today, we are discussing advocacy, access to fertility care, and the threat to IVF with Barbara Collura, the president and CEO of Resolve, the National Infertility Association. Resolve is a nonprofit organization founded in 1974 with the mission to ensure that all people challenged in their family-building journey reach resolution through being empowered by knowledge, supported by the community, united by advocacy, and inspired to act. I love that mission statement. As a fertility doctor for almost 20 years, I have supported and referred many of my patients to Resolve. I've witnessed a true transformation in this nonprofit organization over the last 2 years. It's really transformed from what it's always done so well, which is to provide support and emotional healing for people going through their fertility journey. They have incredible in-person and online support groups. And the second branch of Resolve has always been for advocating for more access to fertility care, helping to ensure more states require coverage and increasing insurance coverage of fertility benefits. In the last 2 years, Resolve has continued to do those things very, very well, but they have taken on a true advocacy for all reproductive rights and fought hard to protect IVF. And that's what we're talking about today with Barbara. I am so excited for you to listen to this show. So it's just important to realize this isn't the first time that IVF has been threatened or kind of other people have decided how to do IVF. In the early 2000s in Italy, in a very Catholic-driven society and conservative ways of thinking a lot in and out of the government and decisions, they limited how many eggs someone could fertilize with IVF. They said you could only fertilize 3 eggs, no matter how many eggs you got with an egg retrieval, and you had to transfer whatever fertilized. It didn't matter if it was 1 or 3. And they wanted to do that because they felt like fertilization and an egg and sperm coming together, that is absolutely life. And so they don't want to do anything that wouldn't preserve the sanctity of life if you think of a fertilized egg as a person. And after they realized that it was increasing the risk of high-risk pregnancies with twins or triplets if someone actually did get pregnant with whatever they transferred. But it was also dramatically increasing the cost to the government that covered IVF procedures because people were having to do multiple egg retrievals because people don't realize how inefficient human reproduction is. And this is not to not validate someone's belief or not, understand that someone could strongly believe that a fertilized egg is a person, but not every egg is a baby. And it can take 15 or 20 eggs to find a normal embryo and to have a baby. And I just don't think it's so hard to, educate and share, but also validate, someone's moral beliefs and understanding, but how that just sometimes doesn't reconcile with, how science and the body works. And how do you continue to try to get this message across?
It takes the science and the personal story. So this is why we advocate alongside physicians and embryologists, because IVF is complicated, and a lot of people, you have to go into with the assumption that they don't know what IVF is, and even if they've heard of it, that maybe they don't have a full understanding. So you have to go in with the physician, the embryologist, the science, and you have to go in with the personal story. And that's where we make the most difference. When I go back to that day in Richmond, the patient that we had, what she said was, no one cares more about my embryos than me. And then she said this, basically, get your hands off my embryos. And I think what legislators and policymakers and folks that want to really regulate IVF, I think they think that they know better than the person who's creating those embryos, and they know better on who should protect those embryos. And I oftentimes think of her so passionately saying that, and that is so true, Laura. You know that,
Yeah.
right? And so I think it has to be both the science and that story that come together. That's how we have been able to do it and to be able to describe it. Here's the other thing. You described the situation in Italy, which, by the way, end of the story is they repealed that because of all the reasons you said, and that no longer exists. We live in a country where our government doesn't pay for IVF. So we don't have a lot of countries where the payer, the government, has a lot of control over what they pay. And in our country, if you're getting coverage from Medicaid or Medicare, there's a lot of control. And IVF is not paid for through those systems. And so you don't see that kind of control because they're not paying for it. And so we see a lot better success rates in our country than you do in other countries because of the standard of care is so high and the science that is used. And so what I say to people is, if you want to access IVF similar to what you described in Italy, in other words, you don't want any embryos frozen, you want every embryo transferred, you want very limited number of eggs fertilized, I am certain that, Laura, you would provide that care to them, and you're nodding your head yes. And I've asked this of every reproductive endocrinologist that I've talked to, and they've said 100%. If a patient came into our clinic and asked for that kind of care, we would counsel them, but we would be able to provide that care. It's highly inefficient, and it is putting the female through a lot that is unnecessary. But if somebody is wanting and choosing that and is going to pay for that, 'cause certainly I don't know any insurance plan that'll cover that, then they would provide that care. So we're at a situation where there are people who believe that that's the kind of care that every doctor in the United States should deliver for IVF. Whereas I say, you can have that care, but your moral beliefs should not dictate what the care looks like for everybody else, because it is highly inefficient. It is very costly. It is provides health risks. Laura, one of the things I say to people is, if you want to look at the lens of regulating a medical procedure, I look at it from the patient perspective. Then two things should be in place. Whatever you're going to regulate, the outcomes should be better and the safety for the patient should be better. If you're going to tell me that by regulating this, it's going to be so much safer and so much better. Wouldn't we all be saying, let's do that? Let's do that.
I hear you.
But that's not the case here at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do talk to patients before they even consider doing IVF. I say, hey, there's a chance that you could have more embryos frozen than what you want your family to look like. And here are the options of what you can do with them. And there are absolutely patients of mine that say, wow, I'm really not comfortable with that. I feel like I want every embryo to have a chance. We talk about the ability to donate embryos to other families to try to conceive, or we talk about not fertilizing all the eggs. We've gotten so highly successful with freezing eggs, thawing them, and turning them into embryos that I will offer to people, hey, we could maybe only fertilize this number of eggs, but freeze the rest as eggs. So we've got, maybe if you get 20 eggs, we're fertilizing 10 and they're turning into embryos, but we are freezing the rest as eggs. Because a lot of people feel more comfortable discarding eggs because they are not fertilized with sperm. They are not embryos. However, the issue is we don't know, just looking at eggs, which eggs and which sperm are going to turn into a baby.
Yep.
And so it is not as efficient. It's okay to do it that way, but if you fertilize these 10 eggs and it turns into your family, great. But 10 eggs often turns into maybe 1 or 2 normal embryos.
Right.
And so
Yep.
if you don't have your family with that, it will cost more
Yep.
to thaw the frozen eggs, fertilize them, and test and all that. So it's basically doubling your cost of IVF,
Right.
which is totally fine if that is your decision. And I have absolutely done that for patients. And I do like that I at least have that option, as opposed to what was going on in Italy in 2000,
Where you're forced
or
to.
you had to do multiple retrievals,
Yeah.
and multiple times with the shots and all that. So that is at
Yes.
least a
Yes.
different option, but it's still their choice.
This is what we are saying now because of the Alabama Supreme Court ruling that now the status of a fertilized egg in the state of Alabama is that it's a person. And so we have that status. One of the things that we did in our advocacy work there was bringing patients and providers together, exactly what I just said. And then we coupled that with media and PR because this story needed to be told. We were not going to let it go quietly in Montgomery, Alabama. And so that spotlight was incredibly valuable in the legislature moving so quickly to try and come to some kind of decision. And so what we've learned in that is that people really care about family building, they really care about access to IVF. And so stories matter, and talking to the media matters, and elevating all of this, because what that does is it just educates the public even more, and people start to realize, wait a minute, I don't want people to not get IVF. We've never had the kind of media attention ever than we've had this year. And now I don't know, there was a Pew Research poll that I saw last week. I mean, in the high 70s of a percentage of Americans, and these are like evangelical, they broke them all down into different categories, Republican, Democrat, who want and support access to IVF. Before Alabama, there was a survey done last summer, and it was by a Republican pollster, and she did it for Republicans in Congress. And her poll showed that 85% of Americans support access to IVF. And that was Republicans, evangelicals, you name it. So we are in a position of people wanting to see access to IVF available. They want to see it not have any restrictions on it. And so you still have, though, this belief by some groups that the care that you are providing needs to be controlled and needs to be regulated. One of the things I've recently said is that the Alabama Supreme Court ruling did a lot of good in terms of bringing IVF out into the open and getting a lot of people talking about it. One of the really negative consequences is because of all that attention and so many people talking about IVF. I mean, we had presidential candidates. Both of them have said, I support IVF. It was talked about in the State of the Union. every member of Congress, every 100 US senators, they've all come out and said, I support IVF. The bad part of all that is that the groups and organizations who oppose IVF are awakened
Mm,
in, and I liken it to, I always have analogies. I liken it to a sleeping bear. The
hmm.
bear's always been there, but the bear's been sleeping. The bear's been quiet. The bear has been restful. And we thought Roe v. Wade overturning was going to wake up the bear. It was this. And it was all of the media and spotlight and conversation around IVF that really poked the bear. And the bear is big. The bear is powerful. The bear is ugly. And the bear has a lot of resources. And so we now have a very formidable foe in organizations who are absolutely focused on regulating IVF in a way that looks a lot like Italy. And so I am very, very scared about their efforts and what they can potentially accomplish.
We're going to get back to talking to Barbara in just a second, but I want to remind you how important it is to review the show. It helps others find the show. This is an incredible review from Vicky. Title is Best Fertility Podcast Ever. How could I not read this review to you? What an incredible title. And Vicky says, I couldn't be more grateful for Dr. Shahine and her podcast. As a mom of one going through recurrent miscarriages, she has made a pretty dark period of my life less isolating and has even brought me some hope for the future. By engaging with experts and other leaders in the fertility realm, she has elevated the health issues affecting millions of women and created a safe space for connection and support. This is so beautiful. I even found a support group for moms with secondary infertility through this podcast. Yes, she's talking about Holding Both, that wonderful group by Ali Karagozian. Thank you, Dr. Shahine, for all that you do for the field of fertility. Wow. Thank you, Vicky. Please take some time to rate the show, follow the show wherever you're listening right now. And if you enjoy this episode, share it with a friend. Now let's get back to talking to Barbara. Let me ask a question about strategy with a little bit of history. So I think that there were a lot of people that sort of went to sleep on advocacy once Roe v. Wade went into effect. A federal protection on abortion rights, allowed people to think like, okay, we're good. We have reproductive decision making is in the power of the doctors and the patients. But there was an incredible, amazing strategy to do little bits and laws and pick it apart. And, you can only do abortion in a place where the walls are this far apart for a gurney, when has nothing to do with medical care. It was just a way to shut down a clinic and access to care. And now that we've lost this federal protection, it has just been like whack-a-mole. And how do we reconcile that it's all about keeping decisions between the doctors and the patients? Because there are repercussions with not protecting access to abortion that have been well far beyond like what people think. People think it's all about just elective termination of pregnancy and people that were careless with their birth control. And it is not. My patients who have highly desired pregnancies, who've worked incredibly hard to build their family, need to have an abortion, because that term is a medical term just to empty the uterus, because they have a miscarriage. And I am fortunate that I practice in the state of Washington. It has not impacted my patients directly, but my colleagues in Texas and other states are not able to treat ectopic pregnancies like they need to be because it's a medical emergency. They're not able to give patients medication to help them resolve the pregnancy, and it's resulted in issues. There are hospitals in states that have shut down and are not giving maternal care. Like, there are so many consequences of this. How do you reconcile protecting IVF, protecting access to just early pregnancy care, put it all together and not just do this whack-a-mole. Like, it was so amazing to see you holding up a sign in Alabama and Resolve and all those stories and like helping resume care in Alabama. But a week later, we were worried about legislation and personhood in Iowa.
Exactly.
And so it gets exhausting,
Yep.
right? And it's like, how much resolve, to use the word, can we have? Like, what is an overall strategy? How do we not lose sight of what the overall issue is? Like, just get politicians out of my clinic and telling my patients what to do with their bodies. Like, how does that stay the message? And how do we not just get beat down by these little, not little, I mean, they're all huge, but it just takes a huge effort to mobilize in Alabama and then Iowa and then Texas and then.
Yep.
So what are we going to do, Barb?
Well, this is the big question, and it shows how astute you are and how much you understand this space that you even ask that question, because very, very, very few people would know enough to ask that question. And the whack-a-mole is the term I've been using for many years because that's what it felt like, and that's not really a strategy, but that was our strategy. And so what we are realizing is that we need to completely change. And so we are in the process of doing that right now. So we believe that there are about 16 states where we believe that the environment is ripe for potential harm to come to how IVF is practiced. Doesn't mean to say that there's a bill. It doesn't mean to say that we know of something. It's just a history. It's looking at what they've already done with abortion. It's looking at other types of legislation that they've entertained and identifying those states as concerning. So, what we believe we need to do as a community and as Resolve leading this effort is we need to think very differently, and we need to build, I like to say it's like protective walls in those 16 states to protect IVF. So that is not a whack-a-mole. That is 24/7, 365 days a year, year after year after year. One of the things that our community has gotten attuned to is looking at a bill. A bill has been introduced. A bill. How about we not have a bill introduced? What would that look like if we had a protective environment in a state because we have people mobilized? They're going and talking to their legislators all year long. They are matched up with the science. There's nobody even considering introducing a personhood type bill because it wouldn't go anywhere. And
Mm.
that is the kind of environment that we need to have. It's very, very different from what we currently have. It's going to take a lot of money. It's going to take a lot of organizing. It's going to take a different mindset. I'm from Minnesota, and one of the things that I was always amazed at is that the Catholic Church, the Catholic Conference in Minnesota, they had an advocacy day every single year in the Minnesota State Legislature, regardless.
Hmm.
They just showed up every single year, whatever the third Tuesday of March, whatever it was, that was the advocacy day, and it didn't even matter. And I look at that now and I'm like, that has to be us, because
Mm-hmm.
the anti choice movement, 50 years of patience, of waiting, and they were showing up every year. They were showing up. They had everything laid out, but they didn't know when it was going to happen. And our community, we're lucky if, I can get 30 people to a state capitol for an insurance bill, which would, help hundreds of thousands of people. So we as a community have to think about this very differently. And so at Resolve, we are planning for that. We are undergoing a fundraising campaign. We are looking at other organizations. We're looking at consultants who know this and know how to set up ground games. I don't know how to do that. But I'm smart enough to know that there's smarter people than me, and we need to have them at the table because many organizations have done this on a number of different issues, and we need to be doing that. So, call me back in 2 or 3 years, and I'm going to say, if it's not
Mm-hmm.
me, the other person who's you're going to be interviewing is going to say Resolve is a very, very different organization, and this is what we're focused on, because I don't know anybody else who could do it, who should be doing it, and I really believe that we must be doing it.
I really appreciate that. Hearing that from you actually makes me very hopeful because we are in an extremely different situation today than we were before 2022. And so the same processes just they can't keep going on the same. And I just really appreciate that hearing directly from you that you're thinking about it differently. I do see hope in ASRM, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, Resolve's Advocacy, our group, the Doctors for Fertility. We all kind of work a little bit differently, but we always come together in the same message. And so I do appreciate that there's just more education, there's more fundraising, there's more advocacy. I'm curious, could there possibly be a federal protection of IVF? Is that even
Yes, it's
possible?
possible. We have a bill. We helped draft that. ASRM and Resolve have worked tirelessly since July of 2022 on that bill. And its current version is called the Access to Family Building Act. This podcast that you and I are doing is now in, May of 2024, and that bill has, oh gosh, over 120 co-sponsors in the House and about 46 co-sponsors in the Senate. And we are pushing very, very hard. The leadership of Congress knows about this bill and is supportive of this bill, and we need to get it passed. And so
Mm-hmm.
we will continue. If it doesn't pass this year, then we start over. And we'll have potentially a new Congress, potentially new administration. We'll have to see where we go from here. But this is a very, very important piece of legislation. If somebody is listening to your podcast and they don't know what I'm talking about, please reach out to Resolve. We have an action alert. You can send a letter to your 2 US senators and your representative telling them how important this bill is and to support this bill and to get this bill moving. I will tell you that I think we need to put as much effort into that as we are at the state level, but we can't. This is the problem now, Lora. It's a play at the state level and it's a play at the federal level. It used to just be at the state level in a few states,
Yeah,
and now we have to be as focused on both. And once we get that federal protection, then we're going to be in a very different place. It's not going to potentially impact something like what we saw in Alabama because of the way that was so unusual with the Supreme Court looking at their constitution. It was not the legislature. So we still have to be aware of what's going on. We still have to have our protective nature up, but it will make a huge difference if we have that federal protection.
that's great. Well, I'm feeling hopeful and excited and just thrilled to connect with you today. I would love to leave the listeners with 3 calls to action, or like if someone's listening and they're excited, they are feeling motivated to do something, what are 3 things that they could do today?
First and foremost, if you're somebody who has struggled to build your family, may or may not have needed IVF, just tell your story. The more people that normalize this, tell their story, it's those concentric circles, right? The people then in your sphere of the world, they'll be able to be like, wait a minute, I know so and so who did this. They're not wackadoodle, right? It's not, this seems like a really important thing. So tell your story. Secondly, if you are comfortable enough advocating, connect with Resolve at resolve.org. We need your help at the federal level. Depending on where you live, we may need your help at the state level, but we need as many voices coming together. And that's providers as well as patients. So
Mm-hmm.
your Doctors for Fertility, we need all of you all. The third thing is I talked about this new strategy. It's going to take a lot of money. I don't like to normally talk about money, but people are really surprised when they hear how small Resolve is.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're roughly a little less than a $3 million organization. And so most national organizations are, tens and 20s and $30 million, if not more. And so we need to really think about what we can do. And we want to do a lot. So if there's somebody listening who's like, I know of a foundation, or my company has a foundation, or there's folks that could help us I would love to talk to you. But lastly, I would just say the power of telling your story and finding ways to do that, whether that's to your local news or where that's to a group or organization that you're part of. You never know who's going to be listening, a legislator, somebody in the media, and how that story can really propel change. And so I used to say, Lora, it's okay if you don't want to tell your story. Resolve is here, Resolve has your back. I literally said that to people in like 2007, 2008, 2010. I don't say that anymore because it's
Yeah.
the power of those voices that'll make it's not Barb Collura's story. It's all of these amazing stories that are going to make the difference. I know it's hard. I I know it's
Hmm.
scary. Um, I look at people who made a difference with breast cancer, with AIDS, with even mental health awareness.
Hmm.
And my God, they did it because they told their story and they weren't silent. And that's what we need in our community.
That's beautiful. So, just to recap, tell your story, connect with resolve.org. And I highly recommend signing up for your emails because you guys do such a good job with targeted emails. So, if there's something coming up in your zip code or your state, you're going to learn about it if you get on that email list. And then I heard that last one, donate. I mean, money talks, and it's true. It takes a lot in order to get people to listen. And it is hard to talk about that type of thing, but it is really important. So tell your story, sign up for the email to be informed, and donate. Oh, Barb, thank you so much for being here. This has been an absolute joy. Just really appreciate your time and all that you do.
Thank you. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for taking such good care of your patients. And I so appreciate you having me on and being able to share this information.
I really hope you enjoyed this incredible interview with Barbara Collura, such a leader in advocacy for everyone who cares about fertility. She's so humble, yet she does so much. She's such a powerful voice. And I really appreciate how she breaks down the things that we can do to take action today. She makes it feel achievable to protect reproductive rights. And I appreciate that so much. We're going to have some links in the show notes that can lead you to learn more about Resolve. I encourage you to sign up for their email list because they actually will target by your zip code what is going on in your state. And just stay involved, take action, communicate with your elected officials, and don't give up hope and work to protect those reproductive rights because we're all in this together. Thank you for being here today. I truly hope you enjoyed the show. Find this episode and all others at my website, drlorashahine.com. You can also find it on YouTube along with more educational content. Share your fertility story, share questions that you have. Shoot us an email to hello@drlorashahine.com. Thank you to our friends at Seattle Sperm Bank and Braze Run Production for sponsoring the show. Thank you so much to my producer, Shannon Perry, and her team at Audiotocracy. This is your host, Dr. Lora Shahine. See you next week. And until then, wishing you love, luck, and pineapples.